Thank you, Dakota. Time's yours.
All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dakota Cookenmaster, and I am a graduate student here in the School of Computing, although I'm pretty sure I've had most of you as either tutees or I've been your TA. And today I'm going to be talking about an interesting technology, React. Out of curiosity, how many of you have at least heard about React before? What's that? Yeah. Okay, so I think a majority of you, a decent number of you. How many of you have heard about JavaScript, just in passing? Or? Okay, good. So we're going to be talking about the differences between the use of these technologies today and perhaps how you should move forward. So I guess an important question to first ask is how JavaScript started and what even is JavaScript? So JavaScript is a high-level, just-in-time compiled and multi-paradigm language that was designed in 1995 by Brendan Eich. So an interesting story about JavaScript is that it was actually developed in only 10 days. Now, for those of you who haven't done any design work in designing a language, first of all, it's extremely challenging to design a language. And the second thing is that other languages, like Scala, for example, took over 2 years to develop. So this was an extremely quickly developed language. The reason it became popular is because it was shipped as the default scripting language of the Netscape Navigator browser. Now, I think most of us here are too young to have necessarily used Netscape Navigator, but how many of you have heard about Netscape Navigator at least? Yeah, okay, so at least a couple. Netscape Navigator is actually the precursor to what you would consider Firefox today. And because it was shipped as the scripting language of what was then the highly popular Netscape Navigator, it started becoming more popular for development usage. Now, interesting to note, Netscape Navigator died kind of a sudden death because of Microsoft, actually. They started shipping Internet Explorer with all of their computers, and Netscape Navigator died relatively quickly. There was actually an anti-monopoly lawsuit against Microsoft, which Microsoft lost. And then, I don't know, through lobbying or whatever, the next year was overturned. So think what you will about Microsoft. So let's talk about the dominance of JavaScript today. So since its introduction in 1995 and subsequent inclusion in all web browsers, from Netscape Navigator to today's Google Chrome, right, JavaScript became an extremely popular technology for developing the front end of an application. This is what you see. So when you look on a website and you see something is being generated for you somewhat dynamically, in all likelihood, they're using JavaScript because it's an extremely popular technology that comes in all modern web browsers. So you'll see all of these browsers today, with, of course, everyone's favorite, I'm sure. They all support JavaScript. Support, subjective term. So JavaScript is a really exciting language, but probably due to its quick development, it does have a few quirks, some things that are kind of interesting. So just for some humor, there's an interesting video. I don't know if you guys have happened to see the WAT video by Gary Bernhardt. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but there are some interesting JavaScript pieces that show how JavaScript has some interesting features.
Let's talk about JavaScript. Does anyone know in JavaScript what array plus array is? Well, let me ask you this first. What should array plus array be? Empty array, I would also accept type error. That is not what array plus array is. Wrong. Wrong. Array plus array is empty string. Obviously, I think it's obvious to everyone. Now, what would array plus object be? This should obviously be type error because those are completely disparate types. Does anyone know what this is?
Anyone?
No. Close. No. Far away. It's object. Right. Nicely done. Now, of course, because this is plus, so you can flip the operands and the same thing comes out. So if we do what? No, that's just an object. If you do object plus array, you get exactly the same thing, which, as you can see, you do. And finally, the only one of these that's actually true is, because you add array to get empty string, that doesn't make sense. But an object plus an object is actually not a number. So this one's actually right. And exactly, right? Like, what is even going on in this lab? I don't even understand what person with a brain in their head would think that any of this making fun of languages that suck, let's talk about JavaScript. If I say array.new 16, or just array 16, I get an array of 16 things, which it represents as 16 commas, which is obvious. And if I then join those with a string, then I get the string 16 times. This is actually the only line in this entire presentation that's reasonable. Now, if I take that string and then add a 1 to it, it interprets the 1 as, or casts the 1 to a string, and then we get whack 1 a bunch of times, fine. Does anyone know what will happen if I subtract 1 from the string? I'm assuming no one does. I'll give you a hint. Does this help? Does anyone know?
Okay, so it was just important for me to illustrate that no language is perfect, and so JavaScript in and of itself has some interesting quirks. But a majority of what we're going to be talking today is less about just the general syntax of the language, and more about what you can do with the language. So a lot of languages don't inherently have connections to build user interfaces. For example, we talk about the Python language or the PHP language, which, I guess PHP would be a bad example, but let's talk about Python. Python in and of itself, without the use of any libraries, does not have the ability to just create graphical applications, to create JavaScript is interesting because when the web was first developed in 1992, 1993, and HTML came out afterwards, HTML, which is the content language, CSS, which is the styling language, and JavaScript, which is the behavioral language of the web, all came out together and have some just inherent connections with each other. So, for example, built into JavaScript is the ability to manipulate what we call the DOM, or the document object model. So whenever you create an HTML page, you use HTML tags, you create a body, you add a div with a paragraph inside of it, you're creating all of these boxes. This is all manipulating the document object model, which is essentially a hierarchy that shows how different pieces in the DOM are connected. So as you can see here with a very simple HTML document example, you can see that the root of the document object model is, of course, the document. Directly following that is the HTML tag, which in and of itself is considered an element. And everything else is either a child or a sibling or a great-grandchild or something like that. Thus, they are all inter-accessible with each other. This is how JavaScript sees a web page. It sees it as a hierarchical linked list of items. And so, given that, JavaScript has the ability to natively manipulate the DOM, which is what you see. So JavaScript has the ability to dynamically change the content that you see on a page, modify it, update it, etc. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick JavaScript example to show you how you would manipulate the DOM in JavaScript. So I've gone ahead and, I should probably put this one here. Okay. So I've gone ahead and done a rough outline of what a generic HTML document is going to look like. So this is going to just have, the HTML tag included. I've set up a basic head section. I've included a script, and I've included a basic style sheet. But you'll notice that there is no real content on this page. If we were to go and try to open this, you would notice that it's a completely empty website. Yeah, everything's opening on the wrong one. And so you see it's completely empty, aside from the title that we see at the top, which I included in the head section. So we're just going to create a generic form that allows you to add some text, hit enter, and it creates a new item. That's all we're going to do, fairly simple. So what we're going to start with is in JavaScript, you generally create what are called templates if you're working with raw JavaScript. This is essentially an item that is going to be hidden, but you can copy it, modify it, and reinsert it into the DOM in order to duplicate that template and have multiple items that look exactly the same being displayed. So for those of you who are lost with me saying that, let me show you an example. So if I go ahead and just create a basic div, and all I'm going to do is throw a paragraph in here. And you'll notice that I'm not doing anything inside of it. I'm leaving the template completely empty. And I'm just going to go ahead and give this div a class name. Now, a class we can use them in order to target elements or to style elements in a particular way. And if any of you are CSS aficionados, you would know that a class can be used as many times as you want in a document, as opposed to an ID, which must be universally unique. So I'm going to create a class, and the reason I'm doing that is because I intend to clone this item and reinsert it in the document. What would be the problem if I gave it an ID instead?
Wouldn't necessarily be unique unless you tried to change it somehow.
Exactly. Unless I modified the ID, I would be duplicating an ID, which breaks the rules of IDs, right? They should be universally unique across the page. So I'm going to create a class here, and I'm just going to call this template for the sake of argument. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to be able to select this, clone it, and insert some content inside of it. Now the content that I'm going to insert inside of it is going to need to be generated somehow. And to do that, we can just go ahead and create an input. Now an input in HTML is just a text box that allows a user to type in some value. So we're going to go ahead and give this a type, and we're just going to make it generic text. It's going to be a text input. If we go ahead and refresh this page, you'll notice that we should get a text box that appears on this page, which of course I can dutifully type into. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to then want to be able to grab that content and do something with it when the user clicks a button, for example. So as easy as it sounds, we can just create a button. And in order to give the button some text, we'll just put it in between the tags. So I'll say, like, create, for example. If we go here, we should get a little create button. Perfect. Now you'll notice that initially this button is not connected to do anything. And of course, nothing happens when I click the button. This is where JavaScript comes in. JavaScript gives us the ability to target elements and to react on what are called events. So if we were to, say, go into our script file, which I included here at the bottom of the body, we can go ahead and start targeting some of these elements. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to grab this button, and I'm going to want to make sure that it does some action when it's clicked. So I can do something as simple as that. So as soon as the page loads, this script is going to then run. So the very first thing that I can do is I can target that element. So I can go ahead and store the result of that element, which is our button. And we only have one on the page, so I can be fairly generic. I can just grab the button by using what's called a query selector. And then I just have to use the CSS selector I would use to target it. Now, if you're not comfortable with CSS, no worries. This is fairly trivial. But I'm just going to grab the first button. That's what query selector does. Grab the first one that I see on the page. And I'm just going to grab the first button that I see on the page. You'll notice that I'm using a variable here, so I'm actually storing that element directly. So given that, I can now manipulate this button and do something to it. In our case, I want to add what's called an event handler to this button. So an event handler is going to receive some type of event. That event can be a mouse click, that event can be a drag, that event can be on key press. In our case, we just want to make sure that when the button is clicked, right, some action happens. So I'm going to go ahead and create a function, and we're just going to call this handle click. And when the button is clicked, what do I want it to do? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. First thing, we need to actually bind this method or this function to this button. So we can do that by adding an event handler to it, which essentially is a small function that says, hey, listen for this particular type of event. So we can use what's called add event listener, and we say what event we want it to happen. Well, what are we listening for? A click. Right? We're listening for a click. So we just tell it, listen for a click. And then what function do we want it to run when it's been clicked? Well, in our case, we created a function called handle click. So we just pass the name of that function down. We just say, hey, when this button has been clicked, run handle click. Okay? Now we can see that this is working if we just log something to the console. if we come back here and we refresh this, and we look in the inspector in the console, you'll notice that when I click this, it should tell us we're clicking it. Perfect. So you'll notice that you have to bind event listeners manually in JavaScript. But that's not what I find unique. What I find unique is that now that we've actually bound this listener to tell it to click, we then have to go into the document, clone our template, modify it, and then insert it back onto the page, which can be quite tedious actually. So let's take a look. We have our template here. So what I'm going to do is when the button is clicked, I want to create a clone of that template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it clone, or maybe template clone or something like that. And I'm just going to select the first class of that type that appears on the page. You'll notice that the first class of that type that appears on the page is always the template, so no worries there. So we can go ahead and do that. We can use query selector again. Select spell. And we just want to grab it by its CSS selector. Now, because this is a class, we can target it by using a period before the name. So we'll just grab it by .template. Again, this will grab an actual HTML element, and we'll just grab the first one that it encounters, which, as you can see on our page, the first one that it encounters should always be the template, right? Now, I'm going to, just for the sake of organization, I'm going to create what's called a main, which is just another box. And then I'm going to insert all of our cloned templates into that box. So what I can do is now that I've cloned it, or I should say, I need to clone it, right? This just grabs it. If I just grab it directly, then I'm modifying the actual template, which I don't want to do. Instead, I want to clone it. Now, you'll notice that I have the ability to pass a parameter to it called deep. You'll notice that when I have template, it actually has children inside of it. And when I clone the node, I don't want to just copy the outer shell, right? I don't want to just copy the div. I want to actually copy the div and all of its children. So what I need to do is pass in true here. That says, hey, copy the whole thing with all of its children. I cannot spell it. There we go. Okay. So now we have a copy of this clone. Now you'll notice that when we look at our document and we refresh this, you can't see anything right now, but if I look at the, if I was to put something in that paragraph tag, for example, like hello, this is of course is the template, it's going to display on the page. And the thing about a template is that you want the template to be there, but you really don't want the template to actually show up on the page. Because if the template's showing up on the page and you have this random box that has really no value, you just intend to use it for organization later on. So all that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our CSS file, and I'm going to say that templates, by default, anything with the template class should, by default, not display. So we'll just set its display to none. Now you'll notice that if I refresh this, it disappears. The template has disappeared. So all that we need to do is, once we've copied this clone, we just need to grab some content and insert that content, and then push that new cloned item onto the page. And of course, where we're going to push those cloned items is here in the main. I can add a little comment here to say that. Template items go here. Okay. So we went ahead and cloned our template. And what we're going to also want to do is grab the value of our text box, right? Because the text box is what is going to allow us to add some content into that template that we're creating. So if we go ahead and also grab that, we can grab the text box. And you'll notice that, there we go. You'll notice that we also only have one text box on the page. So that's also fairly simple. I can just grab the first input that I see. And then once I've grabbed that input, I can also extract its value. So I'll say text box value, and then I'll just say just text box dot value. So in order to see that we're actually grabbing the value correctly, let's do a console.log here. So every time I hit the button, right, every time I click the button, this function should get run, which should grab our text box and its value and then print that out to us. So if we refresh this and then type in some content and hit create, we should get hello world printed out. And of course, as many times as I click it, it's going to do that. I can modify it, and you'll see that that would also get printed out. Okay. So we have successfully created an input, created a button, and allowed, when the button is clicked, to grab the content from the text box. What we're probably also going to want to do is, once we've extracted the value from the text box and the user has clicked the button, we probably want to clear the text box so that the user can type something new inside of it. So I'm going to store this value. You'll notice that I copy and store the value before I do this. And then I can just actually set its value to be empty. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just clear it out. OK. So now that we have grabbed the value and we've created the clone, what we're going to need to do is to just insert that text inside of our template. Okay. So what we can do is we can grab our template clone, and you'll notice that the template clone is this whole thing here, is this entire div and its content inside of it. So we need to grab this paragraph that's inside of it and insert the content from our text box into it. So what we can do is we can grab the template clone, and we can actually query inside of the template clone. And we'll just grab the first paragraph that's inside of there. And we're going to want to store that. I'm just going to be pretty generic here and call that a P. What I can then do is I can set the inner text of that paragraph to be equal to the text value we took from the text box. So then we can say p.textArea, or not text area, sorry, inner text is equal to the value that we extracted from the text box, which is right here, text box value. So now we've created a clone, we've inserted the text that we got from the input box, and we're going to now need to actually put this cloned template onto the page. Because I want you to imagine, we took a copy of it, and we've modified it, and now we need to actually put it back on the page. Otherwise, we're just going to discard the copy that we made. So in order to do that, all that we need to do, I believe we can just append a child right to the document, which I believe should go down here. Or actually, I should clarify. We intend to stick them inside of main. So really, we should query for main and then insert it. So grab main. And you'll notice that our page is fairly small and generic, so I'm always able to grab just the first one of a particular type that appears. Sometimes you'll note that you'll have to be more specific. But in our case, I can just grab the first main that appears on the page. Then I can say main.append child. And I can append our template clone, which we clone. Now you will notice one thing that happens here. If I click the button right now, technically yes, this template is going to be inserted into main, and I'll show you that that is what's happening. But you won't actually notice any content show up. So if I click create, 100 times, and we go to the inspector here, you'll see that inside of main, we actually do have a bunch of template items that are now populated inside of main. Of course, the problem is that we gave them the class of template, which by default sets their display to none. So they're not going to show up. So what we can actually do is as soon as we modify its text, we should really then make it visible. The template clone visible. And that's really as easy as modifying its class. I think we can just say template clone dot remove. How is it? Classless, I think. And I believe classless is actually an array. So I think I can just say dot remove.
Yeah.
And I think I can say remove. I should be able to just remove the template class from it. So let's see if that works. So if we go ahead and add an item, you'll notice the item appears on the page. And I can add another one, and another one, and another one. So this is a fairly simple example, but you'll notice that when we're working with raw JavaScript, we have to do all of this manual selection. It's really tedious. Grab the element, clone the element, insert the element. It actually is quite the process just to get something small like that to work. So if we come back to... So, as I mentioned, JavaScript can be tedious, right? You have manual DOM element targeting, manual DOM element cloning. You have to insert it manually. Then you have to, if you want the page to refresh or you want something to reload, you either have to do that on your own or force a page reload, which is generally not good for the user experience. And you'll note that changes in state, if we consider the number of elements that we have, right? Every time we insert a new item onto the page, if we consider that part of our state, changes in state have to be handled and reacted to 100% manually, right? Any change that we want to appear on the page, we have to explicitly tell it to do so. Because it doesn't enforce, handling state changes very easily. So this is where React comes in. So what is React? React is a JavaScript library that's built for building user interfaces. It's also what we call component-based. So if you want multiple, like let's say that you create some type of box, like you guys have all been on YouTube. You guys see the video clips in YouTube. Well, they all look identical with the exception of the fact that some text is changed and maybe the background image is changed, right? But all of the, and the author, right? But all of the boxes look identical. That is an example of what we would call a component, and React handles this type of stuff really well. And React has this concept of learn once, write anywhere, so they don't really care about what tool set you're using elsewhere. You can kind of set it on top of React, so that makes it really straightforward. So what problem does React solve? Well, in React, you have almost zero DOM manipulation that you have to do. Now, of course, you're using JavaScript, so it doesn't restrict you from using it, but there's no need to. There's no manual selection, there's no manual cloning, there's no manual insertion. And when the state changes, like adding a new item, React will automatically update the document object model for you. This brings us to what is called the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is a really interesting way that React handles changes and is able to make it much faster than raw JavaScript would be. So I will go ahead and, this is kind of a silly clip, but I will go ahead and show you. This explains how the virtual DOM works.
This is the story of React and the virtual DOM. Once upon a time, there was a Vue. He was very happy painting the DOM. Sometimes the model would give some nice data to paint. He knew really well how to paint a UI given all the data. A username, the points, and a colored shape. Piece of cake, and fun too. But then the model sent the Vue an updated username. He had to know how to change his painting to show the new username. To do that, he had to keep track of a username div. He dutifully updated the DOM directly. Then the model sent the Vue another update. This time, it was the points. The Vue added another update rule and started tracking the points div. Again, he updated the DOM in place. Next, the model sent the Vue a new color. The Vue remembered yet another update rule and kept track of another DOM node. Then he changed the color right there on the DOM. The Vue thought that that might be the end of the update rules, but they just kept adding up. He had to keep track of so much, and sometimes the order of the updates events mattered. It was all too much. After a while he gave up. He could not continue. But then the Vue met a friend. The friend was called React. They worked together to paint the DOM. The model would hand the Vue a complete piece of data. The Vue knew how to render this, username, points, and colored shape. He would draw a quick but accurate sketch. Then he would bring it to React, who would scan it. React had very accurate and fast memory banks. It could remember exactly what was already painted in the real DOM.
New painting.
At first, the DOM was empty, so it knew to paint the whole thing. It could paint very fast because it was a robot. Then, whenever the data may have changed, the model gave the view all the data again. The view liked this because he was really good at sketching an entire picture, but not very good at remembering all of those DOM nodes. When he was done, he gave it to React, who scanned it.
Difference detected. Blue circle is now red.
It quickly made a short list of all of the differences. Then it painted each and every difference, but no more. When the model would bring him data, the view didn't really know what was on the real DOM, and he didn't want to know. He just sketched the picture as it was supposed to look, then passed it to React. React would quickly figure out that there were no differences.
No differences.
Everything was already painted correctly. The viewer was so happy with his new friend React. His mind was clear and free. He could sketch the way he liked to and not worry about all of those updates. React liked figuring out how few changes needed to be made to the DOM because it tickled its memory banks. They were
Okay, so a little cheesy, but this is a good way to understand the concept of how React handles what we call the virtual DOM. So when we were working in raw JavaScript, we were actually modifying the DOM directly. We were pulling things from the DOM, we were inserting things into the DOM, we were making all those changes. And you'll know what happens if I wanted to add another text box or I wanted to add another template. Exponential growth in terms of how much development you have to do. It's honestly pretty insane. I don't want to see the code.
This is
So React gives you the ability to handle these changes in a really straightforward way. Not only is it faster than raw JavaScript because it is not modifying the DOM, or we're not modifying the DOM directly. It only changes the DOM when changes are seen. It also increases or decreases development time. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how we would do the exact same thing we just did in JavaScript in React. So if we go ahead and React example here. Oops. If we go ahead and open this up here, what I can do is I can open up a new terminal. And I can just go ahead and initialize the project. Now React has a lot of libraries that come with it in order to make it work. And there's a really easy way of just setting up a project right off the bat. And that's by using a tool either called Create React App or a tool called Vite. I choose to use Vite, but Create React App has some upsides too. So all you have to do is use the Node Package Manager. You can use this. Okay. Use the Node Package Manager, say init, and then just say Vite at latest. What it's going to do, I want this to happen in the current directory. Dot. That says work here. So it's going to go ahead and create start creating our application here. I'm just going to call this React example. And it actually gives us the ability to, Vite actually gives us the ability to use vanilla JavaScript if we wanted to, but obviously we don't. We want to use React. So it went ahead and started scaffolding that project for us. We can just go ahead and install the packages that come with it, which should be fairly quick. And then all we have to do is tell it to run. And it will have a really simple app already built for us. If I run this, it's going to go ahead and set up a quick server on localhost 3000, which if I click, you'll see we get a basic React app. Now, of course, this is all built for us. We were going to go ahead and modify this to fit what we're wanting to do. So I'm going to go ahead and open that folder here in Visual Studio Code. Now, you'll notice that it went ahead and created some folders and stuff for us. I'm going to kind of skim over some of these things, but you have a package.json file, which is just essentially which packages it's going to install for you automatically. And then we have a source directory. Now, you'll notice that in Vite, we have the extension .jsx, which is different from JavaScript files, JS. So Facebook is actually the company that develops React, and they created a really interesting sub-language of React called JSX, which is essentially HTML inside of JavaScript. It's really interesting. You'll notice that I'm inside of a function here in JavaScript, which means I should be writing in JavaScript. But look at what we're returning. It looks as if we're returning HTML. Technically speaking, this is JSX code. It looks just like HTML with some minor differences here and there. So that is one of the things that makes React powerful, is the fact that you have the ability to dynamically generate content directly inside of a JavaScript function. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to do the same thing that we did last time, which is just add an input box, bind a handler to it, and have it insert something on it. So what we can do is, and I'm going to gloss over this just a little bit, but essentially we can store values in what React calls state. State is just a list of items or some value you're wanting to hold on to. So what we can do is we can actually go ahead and create an input. And we'll go ahead and surround this in just a generic div here for now. And this input is the same input that we had in our last one, which is just going to have the type of text. You'll notice that if I go back, it automatically re-rendered for me, and we just have that text box like we had before. I can go ahead and also add a button, which we said create last time. And it's huge, but we have our button there. I think it's including some CSS from somewhere else. I'll get rid of that. There we go. Okay, not huge anymore. So what we can do is we can just bind this button to an event handler like we did before. That hasn't changed. So what we can do is we can create a function called handleClick like we did before. And when it's clicked, we're simply going to want to add the result, add the text that's in this text box. We're just going to want to add that to our state. So if we just call this items, and then right here, I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, we have a function called setItems, which essentially allows us to add something or modify the state. Initially, how many items do we have when the application loads? 0, right? We don't have any. So I can just set that to an empty list. We don't have any items. What's awesome about React is that now I can create that main like we had before. And I'll create that inside that div. And instead of having to manually insert items into the DOM, I can just tell it, use the state. Use the state and build this value from the state. So in JSX, in order to switch over to using normal JavaScript again, because we're kind of in JSX land right now, we have to use curly braces to say, hey, I'm going to start writing raw JavaScript again. So all that I need to do is take all of our items, go over them one by one, and generate our template given that item. So to do that, I can just map over the items. And for each item, I can return JSX, which is essentially our template that we had before. But notice, it's a whole lot simpler. I was going to have to write the template anyway for the last one. But on the last one, I had to clone it, I had to modify it, I had to reinsert it. I don't have to do that here. I can actually, for every item in our list of items, I can just return a div like we had before, and a paragraph inside of it that contains the value of that item. Notice I switched back into JSX again, so I had to switch back into JavaScript in order to use that. But I want you to imagine we have a list of items, and we're simply going over the items one at a time. And given that item, we just create a paragraph with that item. This removes the need entirely for having to do manual selection of the DOM every time we create an item, reinserting the item, and so on and so forth. Now the only thing we have to do is handle clicking. So I'm going to use a little bit of a shortcut here. When on our button, we can just tell it what to happen on click. And here we can just give it our handle click function. Now, of course, because we're not doing manual DOM manipulation, we're not going to be able to, or we shouldn't have to, manually detect or manually find our text input, extract its value, and insert it. Instead, what we can do is we can expect on handle click an event. Now, an event, when it fires, an event is like click. When it fires, it tells you what element that event happened on. We can extract that, and that's called the target. So we can go ahead and extract the value of that input given its, really, we need to have a way to check this value. So I'm just going to scaffold something real fast. Really, we should also be storing the value of this input in state as well. So I'll just do that real fast. Value, set value, use state. And of course, the text box should be empty. This is called a controlled form. What we're going to do is every time the input box changes, we're simply going to push its value to this value box. I just want you to imagine that this value box is tracking the value that's inside of our input. So every time we type a character, it's going to update that state for us. So we'll have to do that same thing here inside of handle change. It's going to take an event. And this is where the target comes in handy. What we need to do is we need to extract the value from the element that is being changed. In this case, the element that's being changed is the input box, right? So we'll simply extract that from the target. So as I mentioned, when an event fires, JavaScript will tell you what it fired on. That's the target. So we're just taking the value from this input box whenever it's changed. And all we're going to do is set the value of value. So long story short, this simply allows us to store the value of the text input without having to manually extract it from the DOM. Then what we can do is whenever the button is clicked, all that we have to do is generate a new item. So what we can do is we extract, actually we don't even need to extract anything because we store the current value inside of value. So what we can actually do is every time they click a button, just take the value that's in value and push it on our list as an item. So they type in some text, they click the button, it gets added as an item to our list of items. So we're just going to set items. And we're going to use some interesting syntax here. We are going to set items to all of our previous items, so everything that was in items. And then we're also going to add our new item, which is just the value inside of value. Because items could technically not be empty. And we don't want to remove all the items that are in items every time we set items. So I guess idiomatically, I should probably use they give you the chance to use a callback, where we can retrieve the previous items and then return a new list of items. So I'm just going to do that instead. So you'll notice that with the exception of me using a function here, the thing I'm returning is exactly the same. Just the previous items and then the new value. And just like before, whenever we clicked the button, what did we do? We cleared the input box, right? So we can just set the value to be empty and not inside of that function. Sorry, right here. So long story short, walking through this, we simply created a normal HTML scaffold like we did before, right? Except for now, instead of having to just have a generic template, we wrap the template in an iterator, pretty much. We loop over all of the items that are stored in our state. And every time the state changes, this is where React comes in handy. Anytime you add an item to the list or change the state, React will automatically re-update the entire DOM for you. No need to use document.query selector, no need to extract values. It's fairly straightforward. So if we run this, we should get it to where every time we click on the button, or every time we modify the text box and then click the button, it should automatically add a new item and then go over all of the items and generate a paragraph for it. So if we load this, and if I type in hello and click, oh, I'm sorry, I need to find the value to this. There we go. I go ahead and enter some content and create. It should create that item for us. Create a new item. There we go. You'll notice that in terms of how tedious things are, with the exception of having to write one more function than we had to write last time, we didn't have to manually target anything at all on the page. We were able to create the exact same functionality as we had in JavaScript without the tedious nature of having to manually select all these items, clone them, remove classes, reinsert the items, so on and so forth. So with that being said, I would like to make sure, I know this was fairly quick, so I do want to make sure that all of you have the opportunity, if you're interested, in learning React. So if you are interested, I have actually taken this course. This course is on Scrimba, if you've never heard of Scrimba. Scrimba is a really cool platform. Imagine watching a coding video, and when you hit pause, it becomes a live editor with all of the code that the instructor was just typing. And you can type directly into the video. It's really cool. I've taken this course by Bob Zarol. It is, and Firefox doesn't seem to be liking, there we go. Bob Zarol is an absolutely amazing instructor. He covers a ton, and this course was just updated. It used to only have 5 hours of content, now it has 11, completely free. So if you're interested, feel free to sign up for Scrimba. I can vouch for this course. It's very interesting. And of course, if you guys have any questions, you are more than welcome to talk to me. I'm generally hanging around here in the School of Computing, and I'm happy to help. Thank you guys so much.
Wow.